In problem C, they actually write out our sequence and give us an idea of what's going on. They tell us what our first element in our sequence is by actually listing it. They tell us that our first element is -2. So A sub 1, our first element in our sequence is -2 just by looking at our list. Now to figure out what our common ratio is, you have to figure out what they're multiplying by to get from one term to the next. Well, if we look at what they're doing to get from one term to the next, well, to get from -2 on the first term to the 6th, they multiply by a -3. Then to get from the 6 to a -18, they're multiplying again by a -3. So what does that mean? That they're using an R, a common ratio of -3, because that's what we're multiplying by each time, a -3. Now we can do our general formula pretty quickly. Remember, the general formula starts out with taking the first term, which is a -2, and multiplying by the common ratio, which is -3, and then raising it to, if we're looking for n, we're going to raise it to 1 less than that, n minus 1, and that's our equation just for a general nth term. That would help us find any term that we want. Well, that was half of what they wanted for all of these problems. The other half was they wanted the specific term, the fifth term, which still starts out with you taking the first term, the -2, and multiplying it by the common ratio, R, of -3, and raising it to, be careful, 1 less than the fifth that we are looking for, which would be raising it to the 4th power. So order of operations is going to make you raise that exponent first. -3 to the 4th power is positive 81 times the -2 that's out in front gives you a -162 as your 5th term. And we are done. Let's take a look at D. In D, again, they list out our sequence with our numbers. So we know that the first term in our sequence is, whatever's the first in our list, is the 1/2. That's going to be our A1. Our A sub 1 is 1/2. That is our first term. Now, how are you getting from the 1/2 in the first term to a 2/3 in the second term? Well, let's see. We've got our first term of 1/2. What am I multiplying by? The question is to get the next term, which is already, they tell us, a 2/3. Well, let's see. Well, to get a 2 on the top, there's no way around it. I have to multiply the top by a 2. So I'll multiply the top by a 2. That will give me the 2 on top. But then the problem would be there's no way to get the 3 on the bottom because there's nothing you can multiply 2 by to get the 3 on the bottom. So let's try something a little bit bigger. Well, the next bigger thing that you could do that's still can possibly reduce to a 2 would be multiplying by a 4 on the top. Well, then what do I multiply the bottom by to make sure I get a 3 when it reduces, because I'm getting a 4 on top now instead of the 2 I wanted? Well, the only thing I can multiply to get that bottom to turn into something that's going to reduce to a 3 is if I multiply it by a 3, which will give me a 6 on the denominator. So that gets me a 4/6, but that does indeed, 4/6 reduces to 2/3, which is what I wanted as my second term. So what did I multiply by to get that 1/2 to turn into a reduced 2/3? Well, I multiplied by this fraction here in the middle. I multiplied by a 4/3. So that's what is going to be our common ratio, is that each time I'm going to be multiplying by a 4/3. So remember that my first term was 1/2. Now I've found out my common ratio is 4/3. So I can write out my general formula, which says start out with your first term, which is 1/2, and multiply by the common ratio, which we just found out was 4/3. And remember, you raise that, be careful to one less than what you have, and we have n, so it'll be n minus 1. That will be your general equation on how to find any term you want. And that is going to be a part of our final answer because that's part of what they wanted. Now they also wanted the fifth term, so the fifth term takes, again, just like the last one, takes the first term 1/2 and your common ratio 4/3, but it takes the 4/3 and raises it to 1 minus what you wanted, which is instead of 5, 1 less than that would be 4. Remember, your order of operations is going to make you do the exponent first. Well, 4/3 to the 4th power means you've got to do what? It means you've got to raise the top of your fraction to the 4th power and the bottom of your fraction to the 4th power. Well, 4 to the 4th will get you 256, and 3 to the 4th gets you 81. So you get 256 over 81. Don't forget, though, that was just the exponent. You still have to deal with that 1/2 out in front. So I have to take the 256 over 81 times the 1/2. Well, basically what that does is it multiplies the 2 and the 81 to become 162. The problem with that step is now I get 256 over 162, and now I have a fraction that can be reduced because 256 and 162 are both divisible by 2. So I can divide them both by 2 to reduce it, and I get 128 over 81. That is going to be, again, my value for my fifth term. And again, just make sure that if you get a fraction, that all of your fractions are reduced to lowest terms.